Hello, everybody. This is the next section of my year in review. So, I'm going to talk about my reading year. But I'm going to do something a little different with my discussion of my reading year because in my exploration of YouTube, something has come to my attention. Some YouTubers that I follow have brought this to my attention, and I think it's worth talking about and not irrelevant to my reading year in review. A particular YouTuber's videos have popped up in my algorithm from time to time, including one, and I won't name the YouTuber because I don't want to get in YouTube jail for any reason. I'm still a new channel, don't have a lot of protection behind me just yet, so I got to be careful. But I think probably some of you might know whom I'm talking about, so I don't really need to say the names, but I will say the title because it caught my attention: The Degeneracy of Modern Writing. Now, this particular video makes it clear what kind of modern writing the video is talking about because it comes with a picture and a caption saying women's literature does not exist. And along with it, you get a photograph of Colleen Hoover's It Ends With Us, Rebecca Yaros's Fourth Wing, Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Mist and Fury, and something called The Deep End by someone, Allie Hazelwood, I think it is. And none of these books, I've heard about them, I've heard them talked about, I've seen reviews of the first three anyway, and none of them is really ringing my want to see bells, so that's not so much my issue, although when I found out that my mom was a fan of the Twilight movies, I had to just throw my hands up and say, you like what you like, and my old judgmental self was put away, so that basically, just because something isn't for me doesn't mean it isn't for anyone. So if you like those, all well and good. I tend to look for different kinds of things, but this was what this particular video was defining as women's literature. And in the video itself, she basically narrows the definition of women's literature to erotic literature, as if women's literature does not really include any other kind of literature. So this is the super specific definition that is majorly flawed, and it contrasts with the other majorly flawed definition that is too broad, which says that women's literature, if it's got a female lead in it, it is automatically women's literature because men don't want to read stories about women. So, both of those definitions being flawed as they are, I figured that maybe I should try to come up with some kind of definition. I think pretty much any definition that you come up with will be flawed and it will have exceptions. But here is what I think women's literature might mean. First of all, to start with, it centers on female leads, so that part is true. But that's not all that has to happen for a book to be considered a part of women's literature. Most women's literature tends to center on what traditionally have been women's concerns. And also, women's literature tends to be relationship based. Now, it often takes the form of romance because romance does have a strong traditional appeal for women, and I'm not going to bash romance. I don't care for erotica, but I really love a well-written love story. So not going to bash that, but that's not all women's literature is, because a lot of women's literature is based around or centered around other kinds of relationships. Sometimes it's parent child, other times it's relationships between sisters, other times it's relationships between good friends, but those relationships form the center of the book. And so you're not really going to get a lot of action scenes. There may be action scenes, but a lot of the action is going to be a little bit more psychological or emotional, as opposed to knock down, drag out, anything that might involve fists or guns. Now, there is plenty of women led fiction that does involve fists and guns. A lot of mystery fiction tends to center on women and deals with issues of logic, issues of solving crimes. But when people think about women's literature, I think this kind of thing, the relationship based story, tends to be what a lot of people think about. And of course, it centers on female protagonists dealing with often dealing with the fact of being a woman. Either the female lead is battling misogyny or unfair restrictions of society, or she is dealing again with those traditional concerns, the Pride and Prejudice kinds of things, because there is a lot of historical fiction that centers around women from that time period that would fall into the umbrella of women's literature. So now that we've got that definition, let me talk about some of the authors that get left out if you follow the whole degeneracy of modern writing theory that women's literature is basically erotica. Let's see who gets left out. And there's also the modern writing, which suggests that this is a more recent phenomenon, and that if your work is written past the early 20th century, it falls into this degenerate group. So here are some authors that tend to get left out of this description: Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, Maya Angelou, Lorraine Hansberry, Doris Lessing, Ursula K. Le Guin, Alice Walker, Margaret Atwood, N.K. Jemisin, Octavia Butler, Karen Russell, Alice Munro, Shirley Jackson, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. What do all these women have in common? Well, they are all women whose work I have taught in my classes over the past several years. So, I guess women's literature does exist, otherwise I wouldn't be able to teach about it. And now, to move on to the second part of my discussion of women's literature, here are some examples of women's literature that I have read this past year. Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. Shauna Lawless's Gale's Song, which starts with Children of Gods and Fighting Men. And I'm reading the last book, Daughter of the Otherworld, right now, but I started it last year. T. Kingfisher's A Sorceress Comes to Call. Hannah Kaner's God Killer series. Glenda Lark's Haven Star. S.A. Chakraborty's The City of Brass, which I read while I'm waiting for her next Amina al-Safari to come out. Nilanjana Roy, an author I recently discovered because I like to read fiction about cats, and I found a great book by her called The Wildlings. Juliette Marillier's The Amber Owl, Molly O'Neill's Green Teeth, Kate Elliott's The Witch Roads, Nicola Griffith's Spear, Antonia Hogson's The Raven Scholar, which was actually my favorite book of the year, and I gave it 5 stars. Cass Morris, the second book in the Avon cycle. Title escapes me right now. I didn't write it down. Sorry. The last book in Sarah El Arifi's The Ending Fire trilogy, which is sadly underrated. And Lynn Fluelling's The Bone Doll's Twin. All of these I enjoyed. I recommend them. And something just to know about me when it comes to reading. I don't finish books I don't like. If I finish a book, chances are it's going to earn at least 3 stars from me because I did like it enough to finish it. I cared about the characters and the situations enough to follow it to the end. And so if I finish a book, that kind of counts as a recommendation. Now, those were not the only books that I read. I listened to the audiobook of Joe Abercrombie's The Devils. And another 5-star read of mine, this was not published recently, but I did read it this year, Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad. Excellent book, very moving. I'm probably not going to read it again, but I'm very glad that I read it. And I'm glad that it is in my head now. So, those are just a few things of a literary nature that have given me pleasure this year. Now, I don't find my pleasure in the same place as a lot of other readers do. Things like the most popular romanticises don't really do it for me. I've never really been all that interested in erotica. For a long time, I believed that I was asexual. I still think that I'm maybe low sexual, although I do enjoy being with my husband. I don't really fantasize about being with anybody else. So that's just never really been something that has appealed to me. However, does writing about consensual sex make something degenerate? I don't really think it does. And I would also say that even if you think there are things wrong with romanticy, I tend to think that oftentimes it goes a little too heavily on the more traditional gender roles and power dynamics. The man is more powerful, the woman is less so. And so it's not like there aren't issues with the books that can be legitimately complained about and critiqued, I should say, less complained about because that's very surface level, but critiqued. There are ways to critique these stories. But your taste is bad and you should feel bad. I don't think that's the way to go. So, yes, women's literature exists. And no, it is not all erotica. And no, unless it is actively hurting someone, I don't think it's really all that much our business what other people want to read. Thank you, and have a wonderfully literate 2026.